You might not realize it, but in the world of big ideas, there's a huge battle going on between two absolute heavyweights, science and philosophy. Today, we're going to dive right into this intellectual showdown and figure out what is really at stake.
All right, so here's our game plan. First, we'll look at why philosophy is having a bit of an identity crisis these days. Then, we'll dig into a controversial solution that some people have proposed. After that, we'll uncover some seriously powerful philosophical tools, and finally, we'll see how we can forge a real dialogue between these two amazing fields.
This whole thing really boils down to one central, kind of nagging question. When science can land rovers on Mars, edit our DNA, and map the entire universe, you have to ask, what's left for philosophy to actually do? And that question, well, that's the spark for this entire debate.
So yeah, you can see how this tension has basically thrown philosophy into a full-blown identity crisis. It's scrambling to find its place, to find its relevance in a world that seems to think science has all the big answers. Think about it like this. Science is absolutely brilliant at telling us how things work, right? From the tiniest quark to the biggest galaxy cluster. But that leaves this massive, empty space, the question of what it all means. And that's where philosophy wants to step in. But its relationship with science right now is, let's just say, complicated.
Okay, so how do we fix this? Well, one of the most popular answers on the table has actually created a whole new set of headaches. Let's take a look at what some call the apologist philosophy problem.
An incredibly influential idea comes from the philosopher Michael Friedman. He put forward this concept he called scientific philosophy. And his goal was to give philosophy a really clear, really useful job in the modern age. So Friedman starts his whole argument from this one big assumption. He says that philosophy and science have already been split into two neat and tidy boxes. But hold on a second, because that very first step, this idea of a clear demarcation, is the whole problem. That's the thing people are arguing about. The debate was never settled. So what exactly is this scientific philosophy? Well, in this model, philosophy doesn't really make its own big claims about the world. Instead, it kind of takes a back seat. Its job is to be what's called a second-order discipline. It just analyzes, clarifies, and at the end of the day, justifies whatever the current scientific theories are. And right here, this is the heart of the critique. According to its critics, this whole approach reduces philosophy to nothing more than a handmaiden to science. Instead of being an equal partner in the search for truth, it just becomes an apologist, a cheerleader whose only job is to say, yep, science is right, here's why. So let's put these two visions side by side. On one side, you have scientific philosophy, where it's basically in a subservient role, just backing up what science finds. But on the other side, you have what's called critical philosophy, which sees itself as a first-order equal partner. Its job isn't to justify, but to question the deepest, most fundamental assumptions science just takes for granted, the things philosophers call ontological premises, the basic ideas about what's real. Okay, so if philosophy shouldn't be just a cheerleader, how do we actually build this critical philosophy? Well, to be a real partner, it needs its own solid ground to stand on. And the answer, maybe surprisingly, is that we need to dust off some old intellectual tools and give them a serious modern upgrade. Which brings us to the toolkit of Kant and Kripke. The foundation for all of this isn't some brand new scientific discovery. No, we have to go way back to the philosopher Immanuel Kant. His whole critical project wasn't about propping up science. It was about figuring out the absolute limits of what reason itself can know. And this part is absolutely crucial. Kant's work was a first-order project. He wasn't just wagging his finger at other philosophers. He was drawing a huge line in the sand for everybody, scientists, philosophers, you name it. He was trying to define the boundaries of what any rational person could ever claim to know about reality. Now, to pull this off, Kant came up with this really powerful tool. It has a fancy name, the synthetic a priori. I know, it's a mouthful, but just think of it as a truth about the world that we can know for sure just by thinking about it without ever having to go out and do an experiment. For Kant, something like the laws of geometry was a perfect example. But there was a huge problem. Kant had based his entire system on the physics of his day, Newtonian physics. And then Albert Einstein came along. Relativity completely upended physics, and it showed that some of Kant's supposedly rock-solid truths weren't so solid after all. His tool was broken. Philosophy needed a new one. So the upgrade comes from a 20th century philosopher, Saul Kripke. He basically gave us a new toolkit. The first tool is called the necessary a posteriori. Okay, stay with me. It just means a truth that we have to discover through experience, like a scientific fact. But once we discover it, we realize it must be true. Think about water is H2O. We had to do science to figure that out, but now we know that's what water is. It couldn't possibly be anything else. Then there's the second tool, the contingent a priori. This is something we know is true just because we defined it that way, like saying the standard meter is this long. We know it's true without measuring, but it's contingent because, well, we could have made it a different length.
All right, so we've got this new philosophical toolkit from Kripke. So what? Why does any of this matter? Well, because it is a total game changer. It's what allows philosophy and science to finally sit down and have a real conversation.
See, the real power of Kripke's ideas is that they give philosophy its own independent, logical framework to work from. Remember Friedman's model, where philosophy was always just reacting to what science was doing? With Kripke's tools, philosophy gets its own solid ground to stand on.
And once it's standing on its own 2 feet, philosophy can finally do its most important job. It can be a real critical partner, not just a follower. It gets to ask those tough, deep questions about science's core assumptions. It totally avoids that apologist trap, and it means the two can finally have a healthy, productive dialogue. And let's be clear, the goal here isn't for philosophy to win some argument or to tear science down, not at all. The goal is to create a genuine partnership, a dialogue where philosophy has the tools to rigorously examine the very foundations that science is built on, and that can only enrich our understanding of everything. Which really leaves us with one last big thought. Science is this incredible engine of discovery, right? But it's not really designed to question its own most basic assumptions about existence. So if philosophy gives up that job, who's left to do it?